Alright, welcome to our next lesson on China. So, last time we talked about the Jia Dynasty and how we thought it was a bit of a fantastical dynasty until they found archaeological evidence to prove otherwise. So, hopefully you enjoyed that nice little movie clip. It did get copyright striked by YouTube, which is funny. Might have to find a different way of doing that or sharing those. Anyways, at least when I upload to YouTube, I can still put that on Canvas just fine. But anyways, going into the next dynasty, the Shang Dynasty. This dynasty is viewed as the first dynasty. I can't really say real dynasty. The Jia Dynasty is the first main dynasty, of course, but this is the first dynasty where you have a centralized authority. But before we get there, I need to explain how the Shang take over the Jia. Like, it's simple. It's a lot like Sargon of Akkad taking over the Sumerians. We did, let me be a part of you. Let me join in. No, 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 says Sumer. Well, same thing here. The Shang family actually represented a power family outside of the the Jia Dynasty clique. They wouldn't be let into that country club type thing. So the Shang actually organized a huge confederacy of peoples who lived around the Jia Dynasty and attacked it. Overwhelming force. The Jia apparently didn't have much of a chance. And when the Shang came in, well, they did take over, but they did assimilate themselves into essentially Jia Chinese culture and things like that. So the way of life didn't change. Like, a lot of things didn't change there, except for the fact you had probably a big war. But you do have a new family in charge. Basically, just new people in charge. And instead of having a decentralized rule, like the Jia Dynasty did, they had what's called centralized rule. This is a concept you do need to know. I definitely have it in your notes. This idea of decentralized versus centralized governments. Decentralized is where you don't have a lot of power at the very top. Like, for instance, the government we live in, the United States of America, the Constitution of the United States, actually has this decentralized idea built into it. That power is broken apart. Yes, you do have a federal government at the top, but it's broken apart to the states, then to local counties, and then to local cities and municipalities, and even broken into smaller groups from there, where all power isn't in one thing at the top like a king or a tyrant of some sort. And there's different ideas. Like, decentralization can be good for at least getting things done, letting people do what they want to do, and maybe allowing for more freedom. Maybe is a key term there, by the way. But that's the way we view it, but it doesn't mean that it always works that way, is what I'm saying. Centralized governments, though, that's where you have all the power at the top. They can be effective, or I shouldn't say can be, they can be incredibly effective if you have a good leader in place, if he has good a bureaucracy in place and not an overburdening bureaucracy. But anyways, I'm about to go down a lot of pros and cons, or all these examples in history, but I need to stop myself. Just know a centralized government is basically a government where all power is at the top. The king and whoever the king invests power into, but really the power is still his, or in this case, the emperor. So, and that's the way the Shang ran things. They did not trust anybody else. They are kind of interlopers. They're coming in from outside, and they're not going to kind of give trust out there. So they grab a lot of power up top, and they make the government big. Basically, lots of people in it that essentially the emperor is willing to trust. Now, the next thing to talk about with the Shang, besides the idea of having this really centralized government with all power at the top, is the whole burial stuff. Now, I pointed out when we were talking about the Jia Dynasty, the fact that they had tombs and some of them look like pyramids. Well, not all of them were built that way. In the case you're looking at the bottom right there, it's showing a tomb of an emperor getting buried and a lot of people getting buried with him, and that's the idea that I want to talk about. When you'd have someone very important who dies and then gets buried, like an emperor, they had a bit of the same idea as the Egyptians, where you take with you what you want. Like, you get buried with what you want to take with you in life. But more so than the Egyptians, although the Egyptians had this to a point with like pets. The moment I'm not thinking they did this with people, but the Chinese did this with people, at least in the beginning of the Shang Dynasty. Like, wives and concubines, if they were still alive when the emperor died, would be many times required to commit suicide over the tomb of their husband, or I don't know, put a concubine. Well, anyways, the emperor commit suicide over the emperor so he could have you in the afterlife as well. If you're looking there, you have basically like a bunch of dead soldiers that also committed suicide so that they could guard the emperor in the afterlife as well as some of his favorite horses. Like, I mean, to us, this is going into the extremes, but this is what people do with some of their belief systems out there. So just wanted to point that out. A bit different, a bit interesting. But the next thing we're going to be getting into is early religion. And if you've seen the movie Mulan, the Disney movie Mulan, I know I reference a lot of Disney movies, but if you've seen that, this is something that in a way that they introduce in a good way. And they don't really necessarily get wrong, you could say, when it comes to ancestor worship. Yes, Chinese religion was based around the worship of ancestors, and everything around you was at the dictates or was at the whims of the ancestors. And in your life, you need to do things to honor your ancestors, or you could have some really bad juju coming your way. So I'll bring up the rest of the notes here for you. Simply put, let's see if I can explain this. When we talk about like gods or the heavens with the Chinese, we're talking about an area or a place or a spirit world per se where the ancestors are. And it's ever present, it's always around you, and they're always there to affect you for good or for ill. And if you can get in good with the ancestors, you will do well. If you anger the ancestors, then of course you won't do well. And this goes on the side of like a grand national scale, like all the ancestors of China and how they affect what goes on with the living Chinese at the moment, and even individually. Like for instance, the picture you see there where you have the Chinese man there offering, well, doing what he's doing, whatever spiritual thing he's doing for his ancestors, and he has all these things up there and offerings put in place. Basically, let's see if I can explain this well enough. Going off of memory, and I haven't looked this up for a while, so I think I'm getting names wrong, so if you know better, please let me know. But basically, if someone passes on, their spirit has to cross a threshold, and I can't remember what the threshold's called, dang it. Anyways, their spirit has to cross a threshold. If it does not cross that threshold, the spirit kind of stays in the land of the living to torment all of those who have the duty and responsibility to help the spirit cross over that threshold. But basically what it's saying is that, you know, if we're thinking along this religion and I pass away, and if my family, those close to me, those that love me, or those that at least had responsibility for me in some way, do not then do the rites and the rituals and the prayers needed to help my spirit get across that threshold, I'm going to stay here and torment them until they do. This is something that really, really is at the forefront of a lot of people's minds to this day in China. We're like, yes, we need to do this. I mean, I'm showing you pictures of it right here. Like this is a big deal. And if something's going very wrong in your life, the first thing you think of is like, oh crap, what ancestor is tormenting me right now? Who do I need to help across the threshold by doing the rites and sacrifices and whatever to help him or her across? You know, that's the first thing that goes into it. You know, in our society, especially from like a Judeo-Christian perspective, or monotheistic perspective, let's go with that one. You know, if something goes bad, and a lot of people think, oh, God is displeased with me. What do I need to do to please God? You know, with the ancestor worship, it's different. It's what do I need to do to help the ancestor get across that threshold into a place called the Yellow Springs. I believe that's the name, Yellow Springs, which is kind of like this, where the ancestors go to have kind of like eternal happiness. Although I don't know if Eternal Spring or the Yellow Springs is all eternal happiness. I need to look this up again. I think there's different aspects to what's over there. So I apologize. I don't have that off the top of my head right now. But this is a big deal. They've been doing this since, well, ever. We don't really know when it started. It could be even before the Xia Dynasty, but definitely was there during the Xia Dynasty. Most definitely there during the Shang Dynasty. That's where we have a lot of records talking about it. And then that bottom picture there is showing how, they still have these major festivals honoring the ancestors. Like that entire festival there is a festival meant to kind of help those to get across the threshold that maybe you missed. And it's like, man, they're you know, kind of, it's like a way of bringing good luck to everybody. It's like, hey, if anybody's being tormented, you have no clue why, maybe this will help that spirit get across the threshold. Anyways, hopefully I'm explaining that all right. Sorry, I was referencing the movie Mulan earlier. I didn't even say why. At least I don't think I did. But yeah, the ancestors are there to help you, at least if they have crossed over the threshold there. Once they're across the threshold, when they're in the Yellow Springs, then yes, they're more in a mindset of, yes, I will help you out, kind of like Mushu. So, now, next thing we're going to talk about is oracle bones. And we've done this with Egypt, we did this with Mesopotamia, and we did this a little bit with India, although we don't know how to read their writing, but here's the writing for the Chinese that we get mostly from the Shang Dynasty. I'm actually not sure if we have writing from the Xia Dynasty, something I don't know. My understanding is the first oracle bones we have date back to the Shang Dynasty. Now, if you're wondering why we call the oracle bones their first type of writing, well, that's simply because that's how they used them. The best way I can say this right up front is an oracle bone is like an ancient magic 8-ball. Basically, what you're looking at there is a bunch of bones with writings on them. And these writings represent essentially like a prayer or a question in a form of a prayer to the ancestors. And what you do is like, okay, what if you have a question like, do I plant my crops this week or should we wait a week? You know, is there going to be a frost coming that we need to worry about? My wife really would have liked to have had that one answered up front after our tomatoes got hit with a bit of a frost when she planted them earlier this year. So anyways, let's say, hey, you know, should we plant now or wait a week or two or something like that? So you go to the wise man of the village and you would ask, okay, should I plant now or later? And I don't know who brings the bone. I would assume you would bring the bone. Maybe the wise man has to bring a bone. Or I don't know, just buy a bone from somebody. But it needs to be a bone. And it can be any bone, animal bone or human bone. For instance, the bottom left-hand corner, that is a human kneecap that is used as an oracle bone. Then in the right picture, the big picture on the right, that's a gigantic sea turtle shell. I mean, that's huge compared to the human kneecap. And by the way, that pit you see in the bottom middle, that's a bunch of sea turtle shells, quite large, all oracle bones. What would happen is the wise man would take whatever bone he gets. It could be a femur or whatever. It just doesn't matter, just something to write on. That at least you can have enough space to write on for the bone. Write on there the question, and how they'd write the question was, you know, in symbols, pictographs, just like the Mesopotamians, just like the Egyptians, just like the ancient Indian civilization, Indus River Valley civilization. They would write the question on it, then they toss it into a fire. And if you've ever been around a fire and tossed like a rock in there, especially a wet rock, you know, it might explode on you, or at least it will definitely crack after a certain amount of time. But that's what they were hoping with the bones. They would wait for those bones to crack while in the fire. They would reach in, take it out, and then they would examine how the cracks crossed over the pictures that they put on there that represented essentially the prayer to the ancestors, or the question in form of prayer to the ancestors. And you would essentially get a yes or no answer or a maybe. That's why I called it like a magic 8-ball. You know, should I plant? No. Okay, kind of get the idea. All right, you can even go down to, should we attack now or wait for them to attack us? Like, you know, this, by the way, going back to that whole fate versus choice thing, very fate-based here, this idea of oracle bones. But this does establish Chinese writing because all of a sudden you start getting certain symbols representing certain things consistently. Like all the wise men start using, I imagine they communicated somehow, but they start getting these symbols down like, yes, this is a tree. Yes, this represents a need, stuff like that. And that overall, over time, has turned into what the Chinese writing is today, or most East Asian writings are and what they are today. So, anyways, I find that quite interesting. I do have a couple movie clips I like to show along with that. I'm not going to do that in this lesson. I apologize, but some kind of show it, or if you want to look it up yourself. If you've ever seen a movie like Stardust, they use these oracle bones in there all throughout the beginning of the movie to essentially say yes or no questions. Should we go north? Should we go south? Or if you've seen the movie Willow, again, the very beginning of that movie, you have a wise man who essentially rolls the bones to get an answer. Anyways, like this concept has been around in a lot of different civilizations, but probably nowhere as much as we see it in China with the idea of oracle bones. No. Oh, I should have had that earlier, but again, that's like me saying it was like a magic 8-ball. Now, the next concept we need to talk of. This is one that I introduced when we showed that video from the movie Forbidden Kingdom, the Mandate of Heaven, and how the Jade Warlord was left by the Jade Emperor in charge by Mandate of Heaven, even though he's a bad guy. The idea is that whoever's in charge must be there because the heavens said so. This is huge. Sorry, I'll leave the dynastic cycle out for a second so I don't confuse you. Like, this is big. Like, when I talked about the reason why, or when we talked about there's only 5 dynasties in China over the course of 2,500 years, this is the main reason why. This idea that, you know what, things might be kind of crappy and I don't like my leader, but the heavens put him there. You know, it's kind of like in the monotheistic side of the world, or in the Middle East, or in the Americas, or Europe. Anybody who believes in any one of the 3 monotheistic religions kind of says, well, God must want that person there. Yeah, he's doing a bad job, but God must want him there. That's essentially kind of the same way of saying it, if that helps you understand that anyway. So for them, it's just saying the ancestors must want him there. And if the ancestors don't want him there, then you might be a little bit more keen to watch for the signs that mean that maybe that this leader has lost heaven's favor. But this also meant that you actually got some pretty, how do I put it? Some transitions of power that went, you could say, smoothly, at least a lot more smoothly than they would have without this. Anyways, I'll get to some of those stories later. But this is a big deal. Again, this is what led to this concept, this idea is what leads to a lot of stability throughout Chinese history. Now, this next thing I'd like to bring up is what's called the dynastic cycle. This is not just a Chinese thing. This applies to every civilization, empire, power, and things like that. But we see it very, very just in your face with China. And it does have a bit to go along with the Mandate of Heaven, because, like, well, for instance, get a new dynasty in place, they do quite well, they establish order, things are good, things keep going well, but then over time, just like with every other civilization in human history, some corruption sets in, things don't go so well, and then add in there the idea of the problems, the floods, famine, earthquakes, invasions, things like that, and those are the signs that you look for. So that's why I say that the Mandate of Heaven has a little bit to do with the dynastic cycle, is that when those things start setting in, those problems, that's when people are starting to think maybe this family that's in charge has lost the Mandate of Heaven. Well, let's try it out. And how you do it is you rebel. But if you lose, that means they still have the Mandate of Heaven. And there isn't much reason to rebel so quickly after that, because, well, people kind of saw that, well, that family still has the Mandate of Heaven, even though these bad things are happening. Well, I guess we'll keep doing what we're doing. So until someone does win, though, in a rebellion, then you see that transfer. But like I said, 5 in 2,500 years. So really nowhere else has seen that type of, you could say, kind of consistency. When I say stability, again, it doesn't mean everything's hunky-dory, but at least the idea that people kind of know how things work for a very long period of time. Even when you switch dynasties, there still wasn't massive changes sometimes. Well, I got to take that back. There's always changes. But not every time was a massive change. Now, I'm showing this picture because this represents the #1 sign that a dynasty was losing favor, or that a local leader was losing favor, or anything like that. That is a flood, especially on the Yellow River. You know, Chinese civilization starts in the Yellow River. They rely on it for their irrigation, and the Yellow River, like the Mississippi River here in the United States, has a massive flooding problem. Like, it's very hard to control. They also rely on it a little bit, not as much as, say, the Egyptians did, but hey, you rely on it a little bit, but it would cause problems. The funny thing is that when it comes to the Chinese, they know that flooding is bad, and whoever gets hit with the flood, that's a bad deal, but they kind of did it to themselves. And I just was looking at an online whiteboard tool here I'm going to go to really quick, just to explain this, and it'll be the last thing I explain. But you'll probably want to put this in your notes too. This is going to be a really bad drawing, most likely. So, okay, so we can draw this out, all right. So basically think of this like you have the river, like you're flowing down the Yellow River. So if it's going to flood, of course the water is going to come up here and flood the land. Now, if it's not a big flood, you want that to happen, because what happens is you have a lot of sediment and minerals and things like that that's come down the water that will actually be flooded out to the land that can then be used for cultivation for farms, for farming, I should say. So you actually want that to happen. But the problem is that, I mean, if you get some really bad floods and you're not just getting, say, the land now able to be cultivated, now you're destroying crops, or you're destroying homes and villages and things like that, and that's what we don't want to see. And that still happens to this day on rivers like the Yellow River and the Mississippi River. In fact, that picture I was showing you just a bit ago on the PowerPoint, that was the Yellow River flooding, I think, or breaking one of the levees or dikes that was meant to keep the river in, like around 2003 or so. So I'm going to erase all this really quick. So that's the basic idea. Now the Chinese think that, you know what, it'd be nice to, come on, there we go. It'd be nice to control that. So what they would do is they would build, is this working? Oh, come on. They build basically what are called, well, we call them dikes. Basically walls, levees, dams, just side walls to contain the river. So when the river floods, it doesn't flood out into the land, it just gets higher. And then when you need the water, you have gates and other things built into the walls here on the side to allow the water to then go over just enough to what you need, but not so much to where it's destructive. You know, control the water. The problem that comes up with this is, I need to use the eraser tool again, sorry. This is easier to do on a whiteboard in class, but I'm doing the best I can. The problem that comes up here is all of a sudden, oh, come on. I can't erase that part. Oh well, doesn't matter. Happens is all that sediment I was talking about, well, it's not all get flooding away. So what happens is it goes down to the bottom and settles when the flood's kind of done. What that does is it raises the normal level of the rivers. Now, when it's not flooding, it's at that height. Then it floods again, and it gets much higher, you know, kind of scares you. So what the Chinese would do is they'd build bigger ones, or bigger walls on the side, essentially levees, dikes, whatever you want to call them. But of course, what happens over time? More sediment basically builds up at the bottom. The river's a bit higher. And all of a sudden you get to a point where you're trying to build these huge walls on the side, but the river, the normal height, like the normal height of it is right there. That is setting you up for a major disaster, because at some point the flood will break over the dikes or break over the levees and just flood everything. The worst flood in Chinese history happened during the Han Dynasty, well, in between the Han Dynasty, to be more specific. There was like a small little short-lived dynasty in the middle that really, no one really counts as much unless you really get into Chinese history. I'm just sorry. I shouldn't be explaining that right now. During the Han Dynasty, there's a flood that is said to have killed about 300,000 people, which is a heck of a lot of people, especially in ancient times. Now, whether that number's correct or not, I don't know. But it does speak to the idea that the Chinese themselves went through massive devastation to the point where they're kind of like a world-ending scenario. And this is the scariest thing for them. Sign that emperor needs to go, or that family needs to go. And by the way, this emperor that was actually this intermediary emperor in the middle of the Han Dynasty, I think they called it the Jin Dynasty. Anyways, it was short-lived, didn't really count. It was like 9 years or so. Like everybody was just like, this means you need to go, and he wouldn't go. And so all of China raised up against him until they tracked him down in the back of a canyon where he had about 1,000 or so retainers, meaning guards, to fight for him. And a battle ensued. It was more of just a slaughter, and they finally ended it when they literally ripped him to pieces, like literally ripped this guy to pieces. And what do you know? everything went back to normal after that. No more floods. Of course, the bad flood already happened and just took all the stuff out of there, and the normal level of the river finally went down. So, like when I say all the stuff went out, like all the sediment was actually washed over onto the land, and then the normal height of the river went down. Anyways, I've been telling the story a little bit too long. I hope this makes sense. But I'm just letting you know that, yeah, the floods was the biggest one to say whether or not you had the mandate of heaven or not, if say you had something destructive. But in a way, it was kind of a ticking time bomb because of doing this. And this is still something today, by the way. And the Chinese and even us with rivers that flood a lot, we dredge those rivers. I mean, we pick the big shovels on the back of these boats and just dig up dirt. It's great to sell off as fertile soil to people, but sometimes it isn't enough. You still get some bad floods that will destroy towns. Anyways, I'll end it right there, and I will see you guys in the next lesson.